The HOA president chose the wrong mom to tase over a mailbox. By sunrise, her petty power trip unraveled a corruption empire. My mother isn't just a homeowner, she's the prosecutor who dismantled mob syndicates. When a navy blue mailbox sparked a war, Cynthia Reynolds didn't realize she'd picked a fight with Cumberland County's most feared legal mind. This is how a $47 fine led to handcuffs, headlines, and a neighborhood revolution. Want to see a corrupt HOA president lose everything? Let's rewind to the 7 a.m. knock that started it all. Mom's hands shook, not from fear but fury, as she gripped her coffee mug. I'd never seen her this quiet, dangerous quiet. Her hair was still rumpled from sleep, and she wore a faded robe. Yet the calm in her expression was the same look she gave murder suspects just before she cross-examined them in court. Cynthia Reynolds, our HOA president, stood on our porch with the self-assured stance of someone who expected immediate compliance. She leaned in as bleach. "The board sees unapproved colors," she said, thrusting a notice into Mom's hand. Her smile chilled me. This wasn't about mailboxes. My gaze slipped to the navy blue mailbox we'd painted only a week earlier. It matched our house's trim and looked perfectly fine. But Cynthia continued, her voice as sugary as it was menacing. "You violated HOA Code 39.2, subsection B. All external fixtures must use approved colors." Mom's grip on her mug tightened. "I'm aware of the guidelines, and there's no list of banned colors. Could you show me where navy blue is prohibited?" Cynthia's smile vanished. "The board knows unapproved colors when we see them. Repaint it white, or pay the $47 fine by next Friday." Mom didn't move from the doorway. "If there's a specific code, I'd like to read it." "It's in our internal documents," Cynthia said. "That's all you need to know." Then she spun on her heel and strutted off, heels tapping against the walkway. Mom closed the door. I hovered behind her, feeling the tension in the air. "Can they really fine us?" I asked. She exhaled slowly. "They have rules, but they need a valid basis for enforcement. This feels personal." We tried to brush it off at first. Mom had handled worse threats in court, gang bosses, corrupt officials, even a drug kingpin who once sent her a dead fish. She usually laughed about petty intimidation tactics, but there was something unsettling about Cynthia's tight smile, the way she sneered at our mailbox, the unsubtle intimidation in her body language. Later that morning, our neighbor, Mrs. Winters, was throwing yet another loud garden party. Guests' cars jammed the street, blocking part of our driveway, and music blasted so loudly that picture frames rattled on our walls. I peered through the curtains, spotting Cynthia arriving with a bottle of wine. She hugged Mrs. Winters, clinked glasses. Then both women looked our way and smirked. "Should we call the police, Mom?" She shrugged. "Document it first. Noise is supposed to stay under 65 decibels per HOA rules." She opened an app on her phone. 78 decibels, she said, snapping photos for proof. She also fired off a polite email to the HOA requesting the exact architectural guidelines that supposedly banned navy blue. By Monday, no one had answered. Tuesday passed, still nothing. On Wednesday, another notice appeared on our door, this time for $120. It cited our failure to comply promptly, even though Mom had asked for clarifications in writing. She called the HOA office 4 times, only to be shunted to voicemail. On the 5th call, someone picked up. "Information is available only at board meetings," a bored-sounding clerk told her. "And when's the next one?" Mom asked. "It was yesterday," came the response. "The next meeting is in 2 months. Mom's eyebrows rose. "I'll need to speak to Cynthia directly then." "She's very busy," the clerk replied, and the call abruptly ended. That evening, Mrs. Winters' teenage son threw a football right into our front yard garden gnome, breaking it. Mom walked over to address it politely, and Mrs. Winters claimed ignorance before shutting the door in Mom's face. As Mom swept up the broken pieces, a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of our house. Cynthia climbed out, flanked by 2 men wearing HOA board member polo shirts. "Catherine," Cynthia called, stepping onto our lawn. "These fines need immediate attention. We're here to collect." She handed Mom another official-looking paper. Mom didn't budge. "I've tried contacting you all week. Where does it say navy blue is disallowed?" One of the men crossed his arms. "The board has discretion to determine aesthetic violations. Pay now or we'll place a lien on your property." Mom's gaze hardened. "Are you an attorney, sir? Because placing a lien isn't just a threat you can make without due process." His cheeks flushed. Cynthia cut him off. "We know the law, Catherine. 3 days to pay. Otherwise, things will get unpleasant." I heard the implied threat and shivered. Mom stayed silent until they got back in the SUV and drove off. Then she muttered, "Bullies." She took a few photos of the notice, shot an email to her assistant at the prosecutor's office, and left a message for Judge Wilson, an old friend from law school. "Cynthia's messing with the wrong family," I whispered. Mom nodded. "We'll see what the records show." Sure enough, Derek, Mom's assistant, emailed property records and prior complaints about Pinecrest Gardens. Mom spent her lunch break at the county recorder's office digging deeper. That evening, she returned to the kitchen table with a triumphant gleam in her eye. 3 families forced out. 6 shell companies, one name tying them all, Reynolds. But proving it meant going to war with the woman who held our neighborhood hostage. I blinked. "You think Cynthia's forcing people to sell so she can scoop up their houses?" Mom smoothed out a printout. The Washingtons, the Garcias, the Patels, all left after incurring endless fines for ridiculous things. A half-inch crack in the driveway, one incorrectly placed trash can, an unapproved shade of paint. They sold fast and cheap. Then properties changed hands through companies linked to Cynthia Reynolds. That Friday, the doorbell rang at dawn. This time, I watched through the window as Cynthia strode across our grass, snapping pictures of our flower beds, measuring the height of our lawn with a special device from her purse. When Mom confronted her, Cynthia rattled off a list of so-called violations. Grass too high by 0.3 inches, garbage cans visible from the street for 15 minutes, a misplaced garden hose, and of course, the mailbox. Mom demanded the bylaws. Cynthia refused. "Pay all accumulated fines by 5 o'clock today or face consequences," she repeated, then disappeared. Mom slammed the door. "This is nonsense." She rummaged through the HOA documents we had from our move-in. There's no actual rule against navy blue mailboxes. That evening, she typed up a formal letter, citing civil code sections I couldn't follow. All I understood was her tone, unwavering. She wasn't paying a penny. She demanded a formal hearing under state law. The next morning, our water turned off. Later, our garbage wasn't picked up. By the end of the week, the side of Mom's car had a deep scratch. She took notes, snapped photos, recorded the license plates of passing vehicles. Mrs. Winters drove by often, phone in hand, staring us down. By week's end, our water vanished, trash piled up untouched, and Mom's car bore that jagged scar. Each coincidence came with Cynthia's smirk through our blinds. On Wednesday, a certified letter arrived, stating we owed $2,300 in fines and administrative fees. It also announced an emergency HOA board meeting on Friday, where they'd vote to place a lien on our home. Mom cleared her schedule. I came home from school to find the dining table covered in notes, violation letters, property records, and screenshots of emails. "It's all adding up to a classic corruption scheme," Mom muttered, marking lines in yellow highlighter. "These board members use intimidation to force sales. Cynthia then buys the properties through shell companies. That night, we found a dead bird on our porch. Mom calmly filed a harassment report with the local police, then called Derek again. "I need anything we have on intimidation tactics, plus information on how to apply RICO laws to non-traditional enterprises," I heard her say. At dinner, she declared, "Enough. I'm attending that HOA meeting. It ends tomorrow." I insisted on coming. "I've seen everything that's happened. Let me stand with you." She hesitated, then nodded. We got 3 more violation notices shoved under the door after midnight. One claimed our porch light was too bright. Another said our welcome mat wasn't on an approved list. And the third was about the new garden gnome, calling it unauthorized occupancy. Mom nearly laughed. "They're panicking," she murmured. On Friday evening, we headed to the community center, where the board meetings were held. It was packed with neighbors, most avoiding eye contact. My chest felt tight. Why was everyone letting Cynthia run wild? I spotted Mr. Rodriguez, the only friendly face, who whispered that Cynthia had been bragging all day about shutting us down for good. When the meeting began, Cynthia presided at a long table with a microphone. She read off standard agenda items in a bored tone, adjusting pool hours, new guidelines for tree trimming, the usual. Then a handful of people stood to speak about trivial topics. There was no mention of us or our emergency lien agenda item. Mom walked to the sign-up sheet, only to see it get whisked away by one of Cynthia's cronies. A man in the back, an elderly neighbor, called out, "Catherine Morgan is still on the list to speak." Cynthia pretended not to hear. She tried to close the meeting, but the murmurs in the crowd grew. Finally, with a dramatic sigh, she motioned toward Mom. "Fine. Quickly, please." Mom walked up to the microphone, shoulders squared, voice poised. "My name is Catherine Morgan. I've lived here 8 years. I'm here to address the selective enforcement of HOA rules and the ongoing harassment my family has endured. Cynthia rolled her eyes. Your 3-minute start now. Mom nodded, flipping open her notes. In the past month, I've received 19 separate violations, each lacking legitimate basis. Meanwhile, neighbors in open violation of actual noise rules. Cynthia banged the table, face reddening. Time's up. A chorus of protest rose from the audience. The elderly man with a timer said, She's only spoken for 20 seconds. Cynthia waved a hand, signaling 2 large men lurking by the side doors. Remove her for disrupting the meeting. Mom held up the HOA bylaws. I'm exercising my right to speak during open comment, as stated in Section 4.3. One guard grabbed Mom's arm. She didn't resist, but her jaw tightened. Take your hands off me, she warned. I have a legal right to speak here. Cynthia's voice rose. She's becoming hostile. Get her out. The second guard flicked a switch on a small black device. I heard the electric crackle before seeing the taser's prongs. A flash of blue-white light arced, and my mother's entire body went rigid. She collapsed to the floor, eyes wide, muscles twitching uncontrollably. The cracks split the air. Mom's body arched, a statue struck by lightning. My scream stuck in my throat as she hit the ground. I dropped to my knees beside her, shouting for help. Phones flashed as neighbors recorded everything. A few rushed forward, while Cynthia stood rigid behind the table, a flicker of shock crossing her face. She was just talking, tears blurring my vision. The guard who'd fired the taser smirked. Should have paid the fines. A roar of voices erupted. Mr. Rodriguez shoved the guard aside. Are you out of your mind? You can't taser someone for speaking at a meeting. She was aggressive, Cynthia insisted, though her voice wavered. Paramedics arrived in minutes. As they lifted Mom onto a stretcher, she caught my wrist, eyes fierce despite her trembling. Jamie, get the blue folder in my desk. It's time. That moment changed our lives. The paramedics rushed her to the hospital. Police cars and news vans arrived at the community center seconds later. Neighbors crowded around, some shouting that Cynthia had gone too far, others stunned into silence. Before I knew it, reporters were shoving microphones at me, asking if my mom planned to sue the HOA. I just wanted to follow her to the hospital. Mom stayed overnight for tests, to ensure the taser hadn't caused permanent damage to her heart. By morning, her office had dispatched 2 investigators to our home, gathering every file we'd accumulated over the past weeks. Photos of tampered water valves, phone call logs, the property records linking Cynthia to shady LLCs, and, most importantly, my phone video showing the taser strike. Detective Ramirez grimaced as she watched the footage. This is more than assault. It's reckless endangerment. Could be battery with a weapon. Judge Wilson personally signed search warrants, and later that afternoon, police raided the HOA office. Cynthia's associates were taken by surprise, escorted out while their computers and boxes of files were confiscated. Neighbors watched from their front yards, some snapping photos, others just relieved. The entire street was thick with tension. Mom came home that evening, bruised but refusing to rest. She was still wearing a crisp, dark suit, determined to show no sign of weakness. A line of patrol cars followed behind her. As she stepped out, neighbors applauded. I rushed to support her and she gripped my shoulder. Are you really going after them? I asked. She nodded. Someone has to, Jamie. Look at what they've done. This started with a mailbox, but it's so much bigger than that. That night, our doorbell rang with a steady stream of people bearing flowers, casseroles, and confessions. Mrs. Gonzalez, trembling, showed Mom a stack of fake fines and a written threat she'd received after refusing to sell her house at half its value. Mr. Patel described how they'd left violation notices about unauthorized seasonal decor hidden on his property. He sold for 30% below market because he was drowning in fines, afraid they'd ruin his credit. Mom listened carefully, taking notes even though her hands still shook from the taser. Finally, close to midnight, Judge Wilson and the district attorney arrived. They spread spreadsheets, property deeds, and bank statements across our dining table. It's bigger than we realized, the DA muttered. Cynthia's brother-in-law works at the bank approving those loan applications, and the security company that tasered your mother isn't even properly licensed. This is an organized scheme. 3 days later, Mom stood at a press conference in our driveway, bandages still visible on her chest. She faced a wall of cameras, reporters jostling for a statement. Her voice was steady. The Cumberland County Prosecutor's Office has filed 37 charges against 5 board members of the Pinecrest Gardens HOA. These charges include conspiracy, fraud, falsifying records, assault, illegal security practices, and multiple civil rights violations. Police cars descended on the neighborhood, lights flashing. Cynthia was led out of her home in handcuffs. She thrashed and shouted, "You can't do this! I'm the president of this HOA." Mom watched calmly from across the street. Cynthia's veneer cracked. "You can't touch me!" she spat. Mom's voice cut like steel. "I've dismantled empires for less than your HOA fees." Mrs. Winters was also arrested, having orchestrated nuisance parties that the board used as leverage to impose fines. Further digging revealed that the security guard who tasered Mom was Cynthia's nephew, recently released from prison for aggravated assault. He had no license to carry a taser and no training. Police found evidence he'd used that device to intimidate other homeowners who resisted paying fines. Once the dust settled, the court froze all HOA funds and placed the neighborhood under a court-appointed receiver. The judge suspended every board member involved in the scheme, effectively dissolving the old HOA. New elections were scheduled. The first act of the newly appointed leadership was to reverse all pending fines and formally declare that any reasonable mailbox color would be permitted. The local news picked up the story, broadcasting daily updates. Neighbors came forward with horror stories, forced remodeling, threatened liens, and bogus citations. All roads led back to Cynthia's shell companies, Reynolds Property Holdings, Pinecrest Investments, and others that purchased houses from harassed owners. Investigation showed they'd raked in over $3 million in fraudulent profits by scaring families into selling. Mom, though still recovering, was unstoppable. She accompanied detectives to the county records office, traced bank statements, and built a case for grand jury indictments. Her background in prosecuting mob bosses proved invaluable. She recognized the same intimidation tactics dressed up in HOA language. Within weeks, the indicted board members were arraigned. Their court appearances were broadcast on every local station. Cynthia faced the most serious charges, including conspiracy and assault. At the preliminary hearing, she glowered as officers led her past us in the hallway. "You think you've won," she snarled. Mom just smiled. "It was over the moment you decided rules only applied to other people," she said. By the time the case reached full prosecution, half the neighborhood had joined class action suits against Cynthia's enterprises. The bank where her brother-in-law worked faced its own investigation. The scheme unraveled, and the families forced out were offered restitution under a court order. 6 months later, Mom was back to her usual self, though she carried subtle scars from the taser. She showed them to me once, a pair of tiny marks on her torso. "It reminds me why I do this job," she said. "Someone has to stand up to bullies." We had a small gathering at our house, a HOA freedom party, some called it. Friends and neighbors arrived with potluck dishes, and we celebrated a newly reformed board where actual neighborhood concerns could be addressed without fear. For many, the biggest symbolic shift was that a dozen neighbors had decided to paint their mailboxes navy blue. During the celebration display on the living room wall, the old mailbox door, plus the 2 taser barbs the doctors had removed from Mom's skin, I asked why she wanted such a grim memento. She placed a hand on the frame and said, "To remind me that standing up to corruption is worth it, even when it hurts." Outside, I spotted Mr. Rodriguez painting his mailbox. When he caught me watching, he waved his paintbrush with a grin. Across the street, Mrs. Gonzalez had already put up a navy blue mailbox, complete with bright yellow flowers painted around its edges. No one could say a thing. We lived in a neighborhood where bullies no longer ran the show. I realized it wasn't really about a mailbox, never had been. The navy blue color was just an excuse for Cynthia's group to seize control and make money. Once upon a time, they'd succeeded in scaring people into submission. But when they tasered the most feared prosecutor in the state, they signed their own downfall. The final hearing was swift. Judge Wilson oversaw it personally. One by one, the indicted individuals pled guilty or attempted a plea deal. Cynthia tried every trick in the book, but as Mom often said, "I've dismantled empires for less." Evidence spoke louder than any deception. As the gavel fell, it was clear that the old guard of Pinecrest Gardens would never rise again. Months later, the new HOA board introduced actual transparency, clear guidelines, fair rules, real community input. Whenever I walked past our mailbox, I felt a surge of pride. Not for its color, but for what it represented. The day a corrupt system tried to bully the wrong person, and lost. As for Mom, she moved on to other major cases, But the local news occasionally brought up the HOA TASER incident whenever covering property disputes around the county. She laughed it off in interviews. I don't recommend everyone settle neighborly disagreements with a courtroom, but sometimes you have to fight back. Otherwise, corruption just keeps festering. In the end, Cynthia's downfall became a symbol of justice in a place that should have been safe and neighborly. People love a David versus Goliath story, and Mom was the ultimate David with a legal background that dwarfed any so-called board president's power plays. We rarely saw Cynthia again, except on TV, where court sketches showed her facing potential prison time. As far as I know, she never apologized. She just kept insisting she had the right to protect the aesthetic values of Pinecrest Gardens. But nobody believed that anymore, especially when the evidence exposed the real motive, profit through intimidation. One afternoon, I caught sight of Mom standing by the navy blue mailbox, a slight smile on her face. She traced a hand over the paint. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded, just remembering how it all started so small. A color, a fine, a petty bully with a big ego. It's amazing how these things can spiral. I looked up at her, realizing how proud I was. How proud we all were to have someone like her in our... If Mom could dismantle mob syndicates, she sure wasn't going to let a power-hungry HOA tyrant push us around. "You never wanted any of this," I murmured. "All you wanted was to paint the mailbox." She let out a soft laugh. "Sometimes the smallest fights lead to the biggest battles. But I wouldn't change a thing. People deserve a safe place to call home, free from bullies, no matter how they disguise themselves." Across the street, families were playing catch and chatting. No ominous cars prowled around. No neighbors spied on one another with cameras or took pictures of grass height. The threat had vanished, replaced by cautious relief and, eventually, genuine peace. Whenever friends ask about that fiasco, I tell them it was never about a mailbox. It was about a group of con artists who found a loophole in a neighborhood's trust, exploited it for profit, and nearly got away with it. They might have succeeded if they hadn't tried to strong-arm the one person who refused to be intimidated. A woman who'd put murderers behind bars, taken down entire criminal networks, and knew every nuance of the law. Tasing her? That sealed their fate. Watching the sunlight glint off the navy blue paint, I couldn't help but feel gratitude. I was grateful Mom taught me never to roll over for bullies. Grateful to have neighbors who eventually spoke up. And grateful that an entire community found its voice. That mailbox stands as a testament to the truth. Corruption crumbles when confronted by the right person at the right time. And in Cumberland County, that person happened to be my mom, Chief Prosecutor, unstoppable in the face of wrongdoing, whether it was a mob boss or a petty tyrant in a suburban board meeting. The memory of that day, from the 7 a.m. knock to the snap of the taser, reminds me how quickly a quiet morning can turn into a life-altering moment. A mailbox was just the beginning. Once Mom sank her teeth into the real crime, it was all over for Cynthia. So now, here's our mailbox. We share the short version of the story. Yes, that navy blue box nearly brought down a corrupt HOA. Because you should never underestimate who might live behind that door. Sometimes it's just a humble family. Other times, it's the county's top prosecutor, waiting for the next case that needs closing. That's how a seemingly trivial violation notice led to headlines about corruption, trial dates, jail time, and a total neighborhood transformation. That's how Cynthia Reynolds lost everything. Her power, her freedom, and her fraudulent property empire. Simply because she targeted the wrong mailbox. And more importantly, the wrong mom.